Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a fascinating game between OngoleBull and opponent, where we get to explore some classic opening ideas and a few instructive moments that can really help sharpen your chess intuition. So, buckle up and let's jump right into the opening phase. White kicks things off with e4, staking a claim in the center and opening lines for the bishop and queen. This is textbook opening strategy: control the center and develop pieces quickly. Black responds symmetrically with e5, matching White's control and setting the stage for a classical battle. White develops the knight to f3, attacking Black's e5 pawn and preparing for rapid development. This is a natural developing move that also helps White keep pressure on Black's center. Black brings out the knight to c6, defending the e5 pawn and contesting the d4 square. Both sides are following solid opening principles here. White's bishop moves to c4, aiming at the vulnerable f7 square, a classic Italian game setup. The key idea here is to put pressure on Black's weakest point early, while preparing for quick castling. Black responds with bishop e7, a flexible developing move that prepares to castle and keeps the bishop safe. This is a bit more reserved than the aggressive bishop c5, but solid nonetheless. White pushes d4, challenging Black's center directly. This move embodies a central break. White wants to open the position and capitalize on lead in development. Black captures on d4 with e takes d4, grabbing a pawn and opening lines for the pieces. This is a critical moment because Black is now temporarily a pawn up, but White will try to regain it quickly. White recaptures with knight takes d4, developing a piece while regaining material. This move keeps the pressure on Black's position and maintains active piece play. Black develops the knight to f6, attacking White's e4 pawn and preparing to castle. This is a natural developing move that also increases control over the center. White captures on c6 with knight takes c6, exchanging knights. This is an interesting choice because it doubles Black's pawns after the recapture, potentially creating structural weaknesses. Black recaptures with d takes c6, accepting the doubled pawns but opening the d-file for the rook. This is a classic structural imbalance. Black gains open lines but has a compromised pawn structure. White boldly trades queens with queen takes d8 check, forcing Black to recapture. This simplifies the position and reduces Black's attacking chances. It's a strategic decision to head into an endgame where White can target Black's pawn weaknesses. Black captures back with bishop takes d8, keeping the bishop active and maintaining solid piece coordination. White pushes e5 here, trying to gain space and push Black's knight away. However, this move actually slightly worsens White's position, as the engine suggests f3 would have been better to support the center and prepare for development. The key idea missed here is reinforcing the center before launching an attack. Black responds with knight d5, centralizing the knight and putting pressure on White's position. This is a strong square for the knight, eyeing key central and queenside squares. White castles kingside, securing the king and connecting the rooks. This is a standard and necessary step in development. Black also castles kingside, ensuring king safety and preparing for the middle game. Both sides have completed their basic development now. White plays f4, aiming to challenge Black's knight and gain more space. However, this move actually weakens White's kingside and the engine prefers knight d2 here to support the center and prepare for better piece coordination. This teaches us that aggressive pawn pushes need to be carefully timed and supported. Black develops the bishop to f5, placing it on an active diagonal and targeting White's weak and dark squares. This is a good move that increases Black's control over the center and prepares for potential pressure on White's kingside. White plays bishop d3, aiming to challenge Black's bishop and solidify control over the center. However, this move is a bit passive and the engine suggests c3 would have been better to support the center and prepare for a potential d4 push. This is a classic example of how subtle pawn moves can be more effective than piece maneuvers in the opening. Black captures on d3 with bishop takes d3, exchanging bishops and simplifying the position. This exchange favors Black slightly because it removes one of White's key central defenders. White recaptures with c takes d3, opening the c-file but also leaving the d3 pawn isolated and potentially weak. This structural weakness will be something White needs to watch out for in the middle game. Black retreats the bishop to e7, a flexible move that keeps the bishop safe and prepares to reposition it to more active squares later. Black maintains a slight edge here thanks to better pawn structure and more active pieces. Knight c3. White develops the knight to c3, a natural and principled move aiming to increase control over the center, especially the d5 and e4 squares. This also prepares to support potential pawn breaks or piece maneuvers on the queenside. Nothing flashy here, but solid development is key in the middle game. Bishop c5 check. Black responds with a check by moving the bishop to c5. This is a good practical move, forcing White's king to make a decision and slightly disrupting White's coordination. The check also eyes the f2 square, keeping pressure on White's position. Strategically, Black is trying to maintain the initiative and prevent White from comfortably completing development. King h1. White sidesteps the check by moving the king to h1. This is a common technique to tuck the king away from the center and avoid any potential pins or checks along the diagonal. It's a prophylactic move that keeps White's position flexible. Knight e7. Black retreats the knight to e7. Here, the engine suggests a better alternative was knight b4, which would have been more aggressive by targeting White's c2 pawn and putting pressure on the queenside. Why is knight b4 better? Because it forces White to respond to immediate threats and can create weaknesses or tactical opportunities for Black. Knight e7 is more passive and allows White to regroup comfortably. This is a subtle but important lesson. In the middle game, active piece placement often outweighs passive safety. a3. White plays a3, preventing any future knight or bishop incursions on b4. However, the engine points out that rook f3 would have been a stronger move here. Why rook f3? Because it prepares to swing the rook over to the kingside for an attack or to support a pawn push like f5. This shows us that sometimes developing or activating pieces is more valuable than making waiting moves like pawn pushes that don't immediately improve your position. a5. Black pushes a5, aiming to gain space on the queenside and possibly prepare a pawn break with a4. This is a typical strategic idea to challenge White's pawn structure and create weaknesses. Knight e4. White centralizes the knight to e4, a strong square where it eyes key squares like d6 and f6, and supports potential pawn pushes. This move also challenges Black's control of the center and prepares for kingside activity. Bishop b6. Black retreats the bishop to b6, maintaining pressure along the long diagonal and keeping an eye on the center. This is a flexible move that keeps options open. f5. White pushes f5, initiating a kingside pawn storm. This is an aggressive attempt to open lines and create attacking chances against Black's king. The key idea here is to undermine Black's pawn structure and open the g and h files for White's pieces. Knight d5. Black repositions the knight back to d5, contesting the center and aiming to block White's pawn advances. This move also eyes the f4 square, trying to limit White's attacking potential. f6. White pushes f6, a very committal move that forces Black to make a decision about the pawn structure. This move aims to open lines and create weaknesses around Black's king, but it also weakens White's own pawn structure and king safety. G takes f6. Black captures on f6, accepting the challenge and opening the g file. The engine suggests that bishop d4 would have been a better alternative here. Why bishop d4? Because it would have maintained pressure on White's center and kept Black's pieces more active, rather than opening lines that White can exploit. This teaches us that sometimes maintaining piece activity and control is more important than grabbing material or simplifying. Knight takes f6 check. White captures on f6 with the knight, delivering a check. This is a natural and forcing move, but the engine suggests e takes f6 would have been stronger. Why e takes f6? Because recapturing with the pawn keeps the center more solid and opens the e file for White's rook, increasing pressure on Black's position. This is a great example of how choosing the right recapture can influence the flow of the game. Knight takes f6. Black recaptures with the knight, simplifying the position. This move is logical, but it allows White to regain some initiative. E takes f6. White recaptures with the pawn, opening lines and increasing pressure on Black's kingside. This move also creates a passed pawn that can become a serious threat. King h8. Black moves the king to h8, stepping out of potential checks and preparing to defend the dark squares around the king. This is a typical defensive maneuver in such positions. Bishop h6. White places the bishop on h6, targeting black's rook and kingside pawns. This is a very aggressive and thematic move, aiming to weaken black's king safety and prepare for a decisive attack. Rook g8. Black responds by moving the rook to g8, defending the g7 square and trying to hold the kingside fortress. The engine suggests rook fe8 would have been better to support the center and prepare counterplay. This shows us that sometimes defending passively can backfire if you miss chances to activate your pieces. Bishop g7 check. White delivers a check with the bishop on g7, forcing black to respond immediately. This is a critical moment where white's aggressive play starts to pay off. Rook takes g7. Black captures the bishop with the rook, accepting the exchange but opening lines around the king. This is forced, but it also weakens black's king safety significantly. F takes g7 check. White captures on g7 with the pawn, delivering a check and creating a dangerous passed pawn just one step from promotion. This is a huge tactical and strategic threat that black must address immediately. King takes g7. Black captures the pawn, but now the king is exposed and vulnerable. This position teaches us how important king safety is, especially when facing passed pawns and open lines. b4. White pushes b4, aiming to expand on the queenside and restrict black's bishop. This move also prepares to support the passed pawn's promotion by controlling key squares. Bishop d4. Black moves the bishop to d4, trying to activate the piece and create counterplay by targeting white's pawns and controlling important central squares. However, white's passed pawn and active rook give white a clear advantage here. This final position shows how dynamic play and piece activity can outweigh material imbalances. Rook a b1. White brings the rook over to b1, putting immediate pressure on black's queenside pawns. This is a very natural and strategic move because it targets black's weak b7 pawn and prepares to contest open files. The key idea here is to activate your heavy pieces on open or semi-open files to maximize their influence. Black is slightly better in material, but white's rook activity compensates well. A takes b4. Black captures on b4, grabbing a pawn and trying to simplify the queenside tension. This move increases black's material advantage, but it also opens lines that white's rook can potentially exploit. The trade-off here is between material gain and positional safety. Black is aiming to consolidate, but white's active rook means black must be careful. A takes b4. White recaptures on b4, keeping the pawn structure fluid. However, this is a missed opportunity because the better move was rook takes b4. Why? Because capturing with the rook would have immediately put pressure on black's b7 pawn and controlled the b-file more aggressively. Instead, recapturing with the pawn allows black to stabilize more easily. This teaches us that sometimes grabbing material isn't enough. You want to maximize piece activity and pressure. b6. Black pushes b6, solidifying the queenside pawn structure and preventing white's rook from invading on b5. This is a good strategic move to shore up weaknesses and restrict white's rook. The key idea here is to create pawn chains that protect your vulnerable pawns and limit your opponent's piece activity. b5. White pushes b5, trying to challenge black's pawn chain and open lines for the rook. However, this is another missed chance. The engine suggests rook be1 would have been stronger, preparing to double rooks on the e-file and increase pressure on black's position. Pushing pawns is tempting, but sometimes improving piece coordination first is more effective. c5. Black responds with c5, counterattacking in the center and queenside. This move fights for space and tries to fix white's pawn structure. The key takeaway here is that pawn breaks like c5 are critical in the middle game to challenge your opponent's control and open lines for your pieces. h3. White plays h3, a quiet move aiming to prevent any back rank or pin threats and give the king some luft. However, this is a missed opportunity because rook be1 would have been better, continuing to improve rook activity and prepare for central or kingside pressure. This shows that sometimes prophylactic moves are good, but active piece play usually takes priority. Rook d8. Black places the rook on d8, contesting the open d-file and preparing to challenge white's control. The engine suggests that f6 would have been a stronger move here, aiming to solidify the kingside and prevent white's pawn advances. This highlights the importance of balancing piece activity with pawn structure integrity. Rook f4. White swings the rook to f4, aiming to support kingside activity and possibly prepare to double rooks or push pawns. This is a flexible move that keeps options open and increases pressure on black's position. Rook d7. Black doubles down on the d-file by moving the rook to d7, reinforcing control and preparing to contest white's rook. This is a solid defensive move, maintaining tension and waiting for the right moment to counterattack. Rook bf1. White brings the other rook to f1, doubling rooks on the f-file and increasing pressure on black's kingside. This is a classic strategic idea, doubling rooks on open or semi-open files to maximize control and create threats. f6. Black pushes f6, trying to block white's rook and solidify the kingside pawn structure. This is a thematic defensive move, but it also slightly weakens the e6 square and dark squares around the king. The key idea here is that pawn moves in front of your king should be made carefully, as they can create long-term weaknesses. h4. White pushes h4, aiming to pry open the kingside and create attacking chances. This move supports future pawn pushes like h5 and tries to undermine black's pawn shield. The key takeaway is that pawn storms on the flank can be very effective when combined with active piece play. h6. Black responds with h6, trying to prevent white's h5 advance and maintain control over the kingside squares. This is a typical defensive reaction to slow down white's attack. h5. White pushes h5, aggressively challenging black's pawn structure. However, this is a missed opportunity because rook g4 check would have been stronger here, delivering a check that forces black's king into a more passive position and increases white's attacking chances. This teaches us to look for forcing moves like checks or captures before committing to pawn pushes. King f7. Black moves the king to f7, stepping away from the pawn push and trying to stay active in defense. This is a logical move, but it also places the king on a potentially vulnerable square. Rook g4. White moves the rook to g4, aiming to increase pressure on black's kingside pawns and prepare for potential infiltration. This move supports ideas like rook takes g7 or pushing g4 later on. Bishop e3. Black places the bishop on e3, trying to block white's rook and control important central squares. However, this is a missed opportunity because rook d5 would have been stronger, challenging white's rook directly and activating black's rook on a more aggressive square. This highlights the importance of rook activity in the endgame. Rook d1. White moves the rook to d1, contesting the d-file and supporting the d3 pawn. But again, this is a missed chance. The better move was rook f3, which would have supported the g4 push and increased pressure on black's kingside. This shows how coordinating your rooks for attack is often more effective than passive defense. c4. Black pushes c4, trying to fix white's pawn structure and create counterplay on the queenside. However, the engine suggests rook d5 would have been better, maintaining active rook play and contesting key squares. This again emphasizes the importance of piece activity over pawn moves in complex positions. Rook takes c4. White captures on c4 with the rook, removing black's advanced pawn and increasing control over the queenside. This move also opens lines for white's pieces and reduces black's counterplay. This is a good concrete decision that improves white's position. Bishop c5. Black moves the bishop to c5, trying to maintain pressure and control over key squares. This is a natural developing move, but black's position is becoming more passive as white's rook dominates. d4. White pushes d4, challenging black's bishop and trying to open lines. However, this is a missed opportunity because g4 would have been stronger, supporting the kingside attack and preparing to open files against black's king. This teaches us that sometimes focusing on your attacking plan is more important than immediate material gains. Rook d5. Black moves the rook to d5, contesting the d4 pawn and trying to activate the rook. This is a reasonable defensive move, but black's position is still under pressure due to white's active rook and passed pawns. g4. White pushes the pawn to g4 here, and this is a very thematic move in these types of endgames where kings and rooks are duking it out near the pawns. The key idea is to pry open lines against black's king and create weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Even though white is slightly ahead, this move signals an intention to attack and destabilize black's defenses. Bishop d6. Black responds by repositioning the bishop to d6, aiming to solidify control over important central squares and keep an eye on white's advancing pawns. This is a sensible, flexible move that maintains defensive coverage and prepares to counter any breakthroughs. Rook f1. White shifts the rook over to f1, aligning it with black's king and pawns. This move is about increasing pressure on the king side and preparing to support pawn pushes or tactical threats. It's a natural, logical step in white's plan. Rook takes b5. Black captures on b5, taking a pawn and trying to gain some material advantage. However, this move slightly loosens black's control over the center and kingside. The rook's departure from the center means white's pieces can become more active. Black is trying to cash in on material, but it comes at the cost of positional concessions. King g2. White brings the king closer to the center and the kingside action. This is a natural move, but here we see a missed opportunity. The engine suggests rook c3 would have been stronger. Why? Because rook c3 would have put immediate pressure on black's bishop and controlled key squares, potentially preparing to invade black's position more aggressively. Instead, king g2 is a bit slow and allows black to regroup. This position teaches us that in endgames, king activity is crucial, but sometimes coordinating your heavy pieces first can create more concrete threats. So the takeaway here is, always consider piece coordination before king maneuvers when you have attacking chances. Rook g5. Black moves the rook to g5, aiming to challenge white's pawn structure and possibly prepared to double rooks or create counterplay on the kingside. This is a logical defensive move, keeping the rook active and ready to respond to white's threats. King f3. White continues activating the king, moving it closer to the center and the kingside pawns. This is a solid, natural step in the endgame, where king activity often decides the outcome. f5. Black pushes the pawn to f5, trying to challenge white's pawn structure and open lines for the rook. This is a thematic break in such positions, aiming to create counterplay and disrupt white's plans. However, it also slightly weakens black's kingside pawn shelter. G takes f5. White captures on f5, opening the G file and increasing the potential for rook activity along this file. This move also removes black's pawn that was threatening white's structure, which is strategically sound. Rook takes f5 check. Black recaptures with the rook, delivering a check. This is a forcing move that tries to keep white's king from becoming too active and maintains pressure on white's position. King g2. White steps the king back to g2, escaping the check and staying close to the action. This is a cautious but necessary move to maintain king safety. Rook takes f1. Black captures the rook on f1, trading off heavy pieces. This exchange reduces white's attacking potential but also simplifies the position, which can favor the side with the material advantage. King takes f1. White recaptures with the king, maintaining material balance and keeping the king active in the endgame. This is a natural recapture. King f6. Black centralizes the king, moving it closer to the pawns and the center of the board. This is a critical strategic theme in endgames. King activity is often the deciding factor, so bringing the king into play is essential. Rook c2. White places the rook on c2, eyeing potential infiltration along the second rank and preparing to support pawn advances or cut off black's king. This is a flexible and active placement. King g5. Black moves the king aggressively to g5, aiming to capture pawns and challenge white's control. This is a bold attempt to create counterplay and seize the initiative. Rook g2 check. White checks with the rook on g2, forcing black's king to respond. This is a strong tactical resource to keep black's king restricted and prevent it from capturing pawns freely. King takes h5. Black captures the pawn on h5, grabbing material but stepping into a potentially dangerous position. This move shows black's willingness to take risks to hold on to material. King f2. White brings the king closer to the center and kingside, preparing to support the rook and pawns in the endgame battle. This is a natural and important step. King h4. Black continues with king activity, moving to h4 to support the advanced pawns and challenge white's control. This is consistent with black's plan to create counterplay. King f3. White advances the king to f3, staying close to the action and ready to support pawn pushes or rook maneuvers. This is a good example of active king play in the endgame. h5. Black pushes the h-pawn to h5, trying to create passed pawns and open lines for the king and bishop. This is a thematic pawn push in such endgames, aiming to generate counterplay. d5. White pushes the d-pawn to d5, challenging black's bishop and trying to open lines for the rook. This is a critical strategic thrust, aiming to create weaknesses in black's camp. King h3. Black moves the king to h3, supporting the advanced pawns and trying to hold onto the kingside. This move keeps the tension alive and prepares for further pawn advances or defensive maneuvers. Rook g5. White brings the rook back to g5, keeping pressure on black's kingside pawns and maintaining flexibility. This move is about controlling key squares and preparing to challenge black's pawn structure. Notice how white is patiently maneuvering, waiting for the right moment to strike. h4. Black pushes the h-pawn to h4, trying to create a passed pawn or at least distract white's rook from its active post. This is a typical idea in endgames. Use your pawn majority to create threats that force your opponent to react. Rook g1. White retreats the rook to g1, keeping an eye on the h-pawn and preparing to contest the g-file if needed. This is a cautious but sensible move, maintaining control and waiting for black's next step. Bishop h2. Now, here's a critical moment. Black plays bishop h2, but this move is a major blunder, swinging the evaluation by over 5 pawns in white's favor. Why? Because placing the bishop on h2 allows white to execute a forced mating sequence. The key mistake is that black's bishop becomes trapped and unable to defend effectively. Instead, black should have played king h2, moving the king to safety and keeping the bishop more flexible. This alternative would have kept black's defensive resources intact and avoided the mating net. The takeaway here is, in endgames, especially with limited material, king safety and piece coordination are paramount. Don't let your pieces get trapped or cut off from defending critical squares. Rook h1. White immediately takes advantage by moving the rook to h1, directly challenging the bishop and threatening to capture it. This move keeps the pressure on and forces black into a defensive posture. b5. Black pushes b5, trying to create counterplay on the queenside and distract white from the kingside threats. This is a logical attempt to activate the pawn majority, but unfortunately, black's position is already compromised. King f2. White centralizes the king, stepping closer to the action and ready to support the rook and pawns. This is a textbook example of king activity in the endgame. The king becomes a fighting piece. b4. Black continues pushing pawns on the queenside, hoping to create a passed pawn or at least open lines for the bishop. This is consistent with black's plan, but it's too little too late given the threats on the kingside. King f3. White advances the king further, maintaining pressure and preparing to support the rook's invasion. This steady king march is a perfect example of how important king activity is in the endgame. b3. Black pushes the pawn to b3, inching closer to promotion. This is a thematic idea. Use your pawn majority to create a passed pawn. However, black's bishop and king are not well placed to support this push effectively. Rook b1. White brings the rook over to b1, directly opposing the b3 pawn and aiming to stop its advance. This move is critical because it halts black's queenside majority and keeps the promotion threat in check. Bishop g1. Black moves the bishop to g1, but this is another missed opportunity. The engine suggests bishop g3 would have been much stronger here, helping to support the b3 pawn and potentially block white's rook from effective defense. Instead, bishop g1 allows white to capture the bishop and start a forced mating sequence. This highlights the importance of piece placement in endgames. Every square counts. Rook takes g1. White captures the bishop on g1, gaining material and moving into a winning position with a forced mate in 9 moves. This decisive capture shows how precise calculation and patience pay off in the endgame. Alright, chess warriors, what can we take away from this final phase? First, king activity is king, literally. Always bring your king into the fight in the endgame. Second, pawn majorities and passed pawns are powerful, but they must be supported by your pieces. And finally, never underestimate the importance of piece coordination and safety, especially when your opponent is threatening mating nets. Thanks for sticking with me through this thrilling endgame. Keep practicing these principles, and your endgame technique will soar. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more chess insights. Also, if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to subscribe to OngoleBull's Chess Journey YouTube channel for more exciting games and analysis. Until next time, keep those kings active and those rooks ready.